Okay. When we go ahead and get started, we have a bit of a varied series of topics that we're going to go over today. It was chapter 12, Economics and the Environment. We do 2 lectures a week. I'm actually going to save some of the fiscal and monetary changes for Wednesday, because I want to talk about changes in the environment which underlie everything in the economy. Because unlike today, what percentage of people would you say are responsible for producing our food today? What percentage of the population do you think engage in agriculture? 10%, 20%, 30%? It's in the single digits, right? And it's very interesting because, of course, if you go to 1900, I'm going to talk about changes in agriculture, but you guys are going to say these are really just like the very beginnings of agriculture. When I say that, oh wow, look, now it's more efficient. Now they can shift resources to other things. We're talking about like a couple of percent. Because even at the 1900s, the start of the 1900s, in the American economy, the U.S. economy, which was a highly industrialized economy at the time, it was, I believe, by that point, the largest in the world. You still had about 80% of the population growing food. And it was only over the course of the century that you slowly see this decline, where today, I would bet that it's less than 3%. I would say that it's less than 3%. I'd be willing to bet something like that, plus or minus like 1.5%. We're going to see that today, because underlying everything in the economy is food production, right? It is the most basic good. If we don't have food, then we're all just going to die. And there had been this really interesting sort of cycle, this sort of recurring pattern.
1.26% of the workforce.
How much is it?
1.62% of the workforce
So less
directly
than
employed in the
2%.
agriculture, forestry, and fishing sector as of 2022.
And yet we've got more than ever, right? We've got more than ever. And it's the early innovations that we're going to talk about today that kind of are the first steps along this road of more efficient. We're going to start talking about efficiency, because there's this kind of traditional worldview. There's a traditional worldview. And we're going to talk about this too, because this is the period of scientific revolution, and this is something we're going to talk about today too, versus a more modern worldview. Now, the traditional worldview, let's introduce some of our kind of sciencey words here. The traditional worldview was interested in theory. And when we talk about scientific theory, we talk about how the world works, we're concerned with 2 things. And really, it's one thing, thanks to Thomas Aquinas. There was Aristotle, and there was the Catholic Church. And of course, Aristotle had kind of fused them together to show that these were really compatible, and it's this Aristotelian synthesis there. And so it was a theory. And I'm going to give you an example. Aristotle had theories about pretty much everything. For example, not just like poetics and rhetoric and policy, the natural world too. He had explanations for why things behaved the way they did. He believed there were certain elemental things of which all things were made of, and there were certain predictable ways that we could tell that they interacted. He had laws and explanations for why the things were going on in the sky. There were these orbs, right, that were moving around the firmament, moving around the earth, and these were later called crystalline orbs. And attached to these translucent sort of glass-like orbs were 55 total planetary phenomena in the sky. And it was all fixed and nothing changed, and they sort of moved around in these uniform, circular, predictable orbits, right? And of course, people would notice irregularities in this. They would say, someone like Tycho Brahe, who he's working in the late 1500s, early 1600s, he's looking at the night sky and saying, well, that's new. That's weird. There's not supposed to be something new yet. Something like a shooting star or a comet. Of course they had seen those, but Aristotle's explanation for that was, well, these are not celestial phenomena. These are low atmospheric phenomena. That stuff's all happening inside of our own celestial orb here. But someone like Tycho Brahe or Kepler, we're all working around this time. When we talk about people like Copernicus, who's going to talk about placing the sun at the center of our understanding of how the solar system works, heliocentrism rather than geocentrism, he's working in the early 16th century. Galileo, who's going to come up with a new way of really understanding and explaining motion. That's really what he's about. Because Aristotle had theories of motion. Well, there's natural motion and there's violent motion. It's really interesting. Aristotle had theories about everything. And the thing is the theories were all intertwined together. So you couldn't just say, well, I'm going to reject that part of Aristotle's theory, but I'm going to keep the rest. It was all beautifully tied in together. You basically had to accept the whole thing or reject the whole thing. And there really wasn't a competing worldview, this totalistic explanation of how the natural world worked. And so, basically, the concern was with protecting the theory. And if you made an observation that was not in accordance with the theory, you would simply find a way to explain how this observation, which is apparently at odds with our theory of how it works, is actually not. And again, so Aristotle's writing in the 330s, 320s BC. Ptolemy, the great Egyptian astronomer, he's writing in the 300s AD, and he's noticing these weird things like, well, it looks like that thing looks more like he just came up with new explanations that showed how actually this is all totally in accordance with Aristotle's theory. And so this was the practice right up until this time. When you start having people like Copernicus, like Galileo, who say that actually, if we make an observation that contradicts the theory, we may need to start thinking about building a new theory based on our observations. Remember I mentioned a fellow by the name of Francis Bacon. He had been one of the ministers who was right there at the start of the sort of a rupture between the king and parliament in England. He had been the prime minister. Parliament had forced the king to dismiss him. He was a founder of what was called the empirical school, the empirical method school. He was someone who said, start with no theory of how things work. Start simply by making observations, collecting data, and then use that data to create a theory. And of course, to us, sitting here in 2025, this all seems rather self-evident, right? Well, of course, this is how we do it. This is a revolution in thinking. In fact, this period is called the scientific revolution. And it leads to breaking with tradition. It leads to breaks with tradition and engaging in observation-based experimentation in agriculture, which is what we're primarily concerned with today, the economics and environment of the time. Because again, everything is tied to food. If you don't have food, you're all going to die. And there had been a traditional way of doing things in Western Europe that went back to the fall of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, which I cannot get sucked into talking about this, so I'm going to keep this to 30 seconds, okay? The Roman Empire had a very complex economy. It was tied into interregional and even global trading networks. Okay, so it was a highly sophisticated market economy where you would grow cash crops. Like, you would say, well, I got this rocky soil here that'd be no good for growing grain, but it's great for growing olives. And then I can take these olives into town, they can press them into oil, I can sell that down at the port because they're gonna ship it into Anatolia or North Africa or somewhere. And then I can take that money, go to the market, and buy my food for my family that we need to eat, and we can buy some shoes and fabrics, which are also imported from somewhere else. Well, when the Roman Empire disintegrates, transforms, falls, whatever you want to say, you basically wind up with these huge latifundia, these large sort of feudal estates, with basically proto-peasants tied to the estates, who are engaging not in a market economy, but in what we call subsistence agriculture. So traditional agriculture was based on subsistence farming. I'm going to erase this. Subsistence farming. What does this mean? Subsistence farming means you don't really have anything extra. you are basically just growing what you need to stay alive. Not because you wouldn't want to maybe grow more, but because agriculture is so darn inefficient. And there's very poor transportation. So even if you could produce some amount of surplus, you're really not going to be able to take it very far. The road system is highly underdeveloped. After the Romans are gone, no one takes care of the road system. It quickly falls apart. Although there are still some like remnants of Roman roads that you can see today. But, so it's mostly subsistence agriculture. Life becomes extremely local. There is also, so it's low productivity, low technology, and it's primarily interested in producing the grains that you need to live, right? So what's the problem with this? Well, there's a couple of problems. And I'm going to try and tie these all together into like a systematic way of thinking about things. Okay, so I wrote this. Okay, so you subsistence agriculture. What is holding us back here, and why is this a problem? Well, subsistence agriculture, you're basically just having enough to eat. You don't have any real surplus to sell, and if you don't have surplus to sell, you don't have any money. If you don't have any money, you can't go out and buy manufactured goods, right? So if there's no demand for manufactured goods, there's not going to be a market for manufactured goods. You're not going to set up a shop to make shoes or something if no one has any money to buy shoes for you. And there's not really a lot of money floating around either. Because during our period that we're talking about here, and I'm going to just tell you, I'm talking about basically, I know I was just talking about the Romans, but from the 1400s right up till where we are here, right at the early 1700s here. This is the transformative period that I want to talk about. Because there have been cycles of innovation and stuff, and really the high medieval period from about 1100 to 1300, things were starting to change. We were starting to see more of a market economy, but then what hit? The plague, which wiped out like a third of Europe's population. And then we had, another 200 years of war after that, like the 100 Years' War and the 30 Years' War and the War of the Roses and a bajillion other wars, war is not actually good for the economy. So we're basically going to pick it up in 1400 and talk about the move to the 1700s. Remember, we talked about this a little bit in the context of the rise of the gentry, the English gentry. This was the class of sort of high upper middle class gentlemen farmers who were applying scientific methods and technologies to their fields. Remember, the earlier system, I thought this was a good marker. All right, whatever. Okay, here we have our field. Here we have our field. And it was called the open field system. You and your brothers and your sisters and your cousins, open field system. You all were either tenant farmers or serfs of the Lord. And he had all these lands, and they were common lands. They were common lands and open fields. So there'd be common land, which I'll do in blue. Common land. These were just large open fields, like this. And then you had your planting lands here, and they were what was called open field. Okay? So the common land right here was basically just empty, grassy land where all your animals could just go eat grass. Okay? So this is basically all the nutritional value that your animals, whatever animals you have, are going to get. Okay? Now this is a problem, okay? Because it's common land. No one has any incentive to make deliberate improvements to this, right? And it's just grassland, so it's not very high in nutrients. So what does that mean? It means the animals are small. It means they're not very healthy, not very big. It means they're not producing a lot of manure. And manure is the only fertilizer that they have at this point. There's no chemical fertilizer. So all of these things are problems. We're going to talk about how the agricultural revolution solves these problems and produces bigger animals and more manure and all this stuff. Now, that's the common land. That's the common land. That's where all the animals can go and graze. The open field system is where each year you're going to be assigned an allotted part of the field. Now, this field is huge, right? We're talking about vast estates here. And you and your family would get assigned 30, 40, 50 strips. Okay? Now, they weren't contiguous. They were not next to each other. They'd just be rotated all over. So maybe this year you've got a strip here, you've got a little strip here, and you've got a little strip here, and you've got a little strip here, and you've got another one here, and you got another one here, right? And so there are hundreds of families working these little strips of land. Now there are a couple of things that couple of problems this poses. Number one, you're all planting because right next to you is like, this is another person's strip, right? And then there's another person's strip, right? We really need to be coordinated. We kind of have to coordinate our activities here. You can't have 50 families planting 50 different things at different times all over these different fields. You just can't do it. So what winds up happening is decisions are made communally. What to plant, when to plant it, how much to plant it, when to harvest it. And what's going to happen in a situation like this is the conservative faction of the peasantry, the conservatives, are always going to win out because it's basically a vote. So even if you have one or two families who say, listen, we're barely getting by planting barley and wheat and oats year after year after year. In fact, what's happening to the fields as you plant the same thing over and over and over again is yields are actually going down. A steady decline over time, right? So you have some peasants who maybe say, listen, we should plant something different. We should plant some hemp. Hemp, I hear there's an amazing market for hemp. Hemp was really for ropes, like the good strong ropes that you need for these sailing ships. And of course, this is the period of exploration and imperial expansion. So you need ships, you need lots and lots of rope, right? And saying, listen, there's a phenomenal market for rope. Let's try planting half the field with hemp or something. And then we can sell that hemp, bring back tons of money, we can buy any extra food that we need. Well, we've never grown hemp before. Sounds risky. What if it doesn't work? Half of us are going to starve to death, right? You're talking about taking half our field and planting it with something that none of us know anything about. We've never planted it before. My dad didn't plant it, your dad didn't plant it, your grandpa didn't plant it. We've been planting the same things on this field for centuries. And we're not about to try something new. It's not until these fields start getting privatized, broken off, fenced in, enclosed. We'll talk about the enclosure movement in just a minute. Where all of a sudden it's, okay, if you want to take a shot, go for it. Maybe you'll starve, maybe you'll get rich. Most of the people who take these chances do wind up becoming more prosperous, and that's why England and Dutch provinces wind up being much more successful than their rivals. It's because they're the ones who are going to be introducing a lot of the innovations that I'm going to talk about today. So the open field system, remember, they recognized this problem of declining yields, and they had sort of an intuitive understanding that you need to let the soil rest. They didn't have the theory of, we need to put nitrogen into the soil because it's depleting the nitrogen and the phosphorus. They didn't have a theory of that, but they kind of understood basically like, if you work too much, if I work you too hard, you'll need to rest. And if I let you rest, then you'll be able to work better than if I keep just trying to work. And they had this like very rudimentary understanding, like, we need to let the field rest. Well, this was called the fallow system. So let's say we have 3 fields. Now this would be like if you were doing like real good, right? So 3 fields. You got 3 fields. 1, 2, 3. What we would do is we'd plant these 2 fields and we would leave this one sitting for that year. We would leave it sitting for that year. We'd plow it up. We'd aerate the soil. Again, they didn't really understand that like this was letting nitrogen from the atmosphere go into the soil. That is what was happening. Then the next year, they would plant these 2 fields and leave this one to rest. It was called the fallow system. And it did keep, the population fed, if we're not like literally starving to death most of the time. So it did work. But we can see that there's a huge problem here. If you have 3 fields and you have to leave 1 fallow every single year, you are starting off the year with a 33.33333% inefficiency. And a lot of times, this was like a best case scenario, you had 3 fields. A lot of times it was a 2-field system, where you're leaving half your fields unplanted. This is a huge problem, huge inefficiency. So, as I said, right around the 16th and the late 16th, early 17th century, you start getting these ideas about how to experiment to increase these yields. Okay, so what happens? Well, a couple of things. First of all, enclosure. The Enclosure Acts. The most famous of these were in England. The Enclosure Acts. They're the most famous because whenever Karl Marx wanted to complain about something, he always picked the English. So, the Enclosure Acts, the English Enclosure Acts. This essentially privatized the land. It said, no more of this common field shared stuff. No, we're going to split up. There's not going to be common land for grazing anymore. That's all going to be divided up, and you're going to fence it in. There's going to be no more of the open field system. It's going to be fenced off, and you're going to individually farm it however you want to do it. The Enclosure Acts. This is going to allow those handful of adventurous, entrepreneurial, small farmers and peasants to take a chance at making some money, at innovating, at trying and planting new things. And this leads to a recognition by an English agronomist by the name of Jethro Tull. I want to be clear too, most of the people who were trying these experiments were part of that gentry class, the kind who were wresting control of Parliament from the nobles and who were going to chop the head off the king. These are the ones who were very involved in overseas trade and in commerce. These were people who were very thrifty and kind of natural improvers of things. They'd see a process, they'd see an opportunity, and they'd start thinking about how do we make the most of this opportunity. It was mostly and this is Jethro Tull's family. He was from one of those like gentry type families where they're saying, okay, now we've made money in commerce and things, now we have land. And again, the nobles treat it traditionally. Well, it's just things are traditionally done this way. Have you guys ever seen Downton Abbey?
That's my mom's favorite show.
Alright, well, there's like it's your mom's favorite show. Okay, it's a good show. It's a good show. Okay, so there's this English lord, and he very much represents this old style mindset, and his heir is like this, because it was all blood, right? It was all hereditary. So he doesn't have a son, and so the whole estate is going to wind up going to this like middle class like lawyer who's like the second cousin of his son's whatever, right? And so he comes bringing this like very middle class like thrifty mentality to like, well, it seems like this field is inefficient. Shouldn't we be trying to mechanize and all these things? And I forget his name. Lord Robert is just like completely appalled, right? Like that's just not how you do things. You don't just evict your peasant farmers and bring in tractors and stuff. That's just not how it's been done. It's always been done this way. And so you have this kind of early conflict here. Someone like Jethro Tull is looking at the fields and he's saying, let's try something new. And he makes some discoveries. He finds that if you plant things like peas, like alfalfa, like soybeans, in your fallow field that year, so you plant your 2 fields, and you plant your soybeans or alfalfa or whatever in this field, the next year, if you then plant the oats or the wheat or the corn or potatoes in this field, holy smokes, they're like the biggest crops you've ever seen come out of these fields. And again, they don't have like a theory of nitrogen or anything, they just come to realize that these fodder crops, they call them fodder crops. Why? Because not only do these crops replenish your soil, they can then turn around and feed these to their animals. So instead of just like some measly grass clippings, which like grass is just not very nutrient dense, you can plant a big field full of soybeans or alfalfa, which will replenish your soil for your harvest next year, and you can turn around and feed that to your animals, and they get big and huge and strong and meaty and reproduce more, right? These healthier animals will make more offspring. And, sorry, totally lost my train of thought there. Yes, you have the animals, they're bigger, stronger, they eat more, they make more manure. Now you have more fertilizer that you can slap on your fields. So this kind of simple innovation, this idea that like, if we just plant these certain crops, it's going to replenish the soil to make more of the wheat and barley and oats and things that we need. It's also going to provide food, very nutrient-dense food for our animals, which is going to give us more eggs, more beef, more milk, more dairy products in general. And then it's also going to provide us more manure to put on our fields to grow more food. So you can see why all of a sudden food production starts to seriously ramp up throughout this period, the 18th century. Okay, these are discoveries that are kind of being made and slowly formulated and implemented in the late 17th century, the late 1600s, and it's a gradual process of this transformation happening. Like this all takes many decades to spread, and you're still very vulnerable to natural disasters. A bad flood, a really hard winter where the cold, you put your crops in the ground because hey, it's May, we got to get planting here, and then you get a frost or something, like some freak frost. And of course, as you saw in your book, we're at a period here in European history called the mini ice age, right? These were like historically cold periods. So even though they have all these innovations, really, it's still going to result in periodic food problems. And it's really not until the 19th century, especially the latter half of the 19th century, that we see these food problems pretty much disappear, and you stop seeing these massive famines. The Irish potato famine is probably really the last one, and there are reasons for that that I'm going to go into as well. So, another thing that we have here, now all of a sudden, we are able to grow more food, more than we need. We can now send some to the market. We can then take that surplus money now, and we can go buy manufactured goods. This increased demand for manufactured goods leads to more people entering into the manufacturing business. The more people who are entering the manufacturing business, the more businesses there are, the more labor that's being applied there, the more products there are, the cheaper they are becoming, right? If there's only 2 of us making shirts, it's going to be more expensive than if 50 of us are making shirts. And if 50 of us are making shirts, our profit margins are so low that some of us are going to exit the shirt making business, and we're going to start making coats or shawls, or I don't know, something. We're going to stop doing that. Some of us are going to exit the marketplace, which will cause the profits to rise for the remaining participants. We're going to be moving into something else. So this is going to lead to a lot of diversification in the economy, the manufacturing economy. And again, the book does a good job. It's a rather lengthy chapter because they really go into good detail. Wise Ranks goes into really good detail talking about all the different products and sort of the consumer revolution that's going on. People want to work harder. At some point, like you have enough to live at some point now, right? But there's also this whole consumer market that has emerged. Even if you had surplus hundreds of years before, like in 1400, maybe you could get like some spices or something. Now all of a sudden, there's coffee and tea and tomatoes and tobacco. And there's all these different, what they called colonial goods. These were all goods that were coming in as a result of trade with the Americas and with the East. Things like porcelain, things like China. One thing that like totally blew my mind when I learned this, I don't remember when I learned it, but because I'm Italian, and so like, I don't know, for me like tomato-based dishes, especially like in the South, it's just kind of like, well, of course, that's basically, yeah. And then I remember learning like tomatoes actually were not native to Europe, like they were brought as part of the Columbian exchange, and it's like, what? Were no tomatoes before 1500?
It's such like a staple of Italian food.
Right, but
like, oh.
it's relatively recent, you find, and then the idea that like there weren't any noodles until like people like Marco Polo came from China, and were like, yo, they take this the wheat and they like roll it like this, and then that's basically how it is. It's almost the exact demonstration of how noodles are made. Making pasta is actually a lot of fun. You definitely want one of those wheel things, though. I have seen people who can like use their hands to do it, but it's like, that's thousands of hours of practice right there. 1680 to 1730, the coldest period of the Little Ice Age. This is on page 477. Oh, another thing that really helps, because population, right? We only have 2 things, really. We have 3 things. We have three things that can together create goods. We have labor, we have the natural resource endowments. These are things like, hey, there's a tree over there. Hey, there's some ground right here. And then we have capital. These are the human innovations that we can use. A plow, a shovel, a harness for some oxen, right? These are all capital goods, right? You can combine all these things. Well, these all result in larger population growth, which of course can produce more things. But another big one here is the undertaking of public works projects. And specifically, I'm talking about things like draining marshy areas. Because marshy areas breed mosquitoes, and mosquitoes carried malaria. And malaria was a huge killer, an absolutely huge killer. So things like draining swamps and fens, things like trying to, by the scientific revolution, they had microscopes now. And they had discovered, remember, I said the scientific revolution, about mid-16th century to the mid-17th century. This is when all these things are starting to happen, when they're making the discoveries about, oh, I think maybe the Earth is not at the center of the universe, which had all sorts of implications for Aristotelian motion theory, because the reason things went down when you threw them is because Earth was at the center of all the universe. And so like the center of the Earth was the literal exact center of everything, and the natural motion theory said that things are attracted to the center of the universe. So again, this is not a class about intellectual history. Just understand that when someone comes along and says, hey, I think the reason that some of these observations seem a little kooky is because the planets might not be moving in circles. I think they might actually be ellipticals. Also, I think the planets might get slower when they're farther away and then speed up in their orbit as they get closer. Also, I think the sun might be what they're all orbiting around. Again, this had radical connotations to it, and it's one of the reasons the Catholic Church fought it ferociously.
I thought it was the Catholics that were bringing up those ideas.
There were individual, because that's a good point. Who were the intellectuals of high medieval and late medieval society?
It'd be the monks, right?
It was the monks. They were the only literate people around. Even when you had a nobleman or some rich guy, he probably couldn't read. What was his role in society? Chopping heads off, right? You don't need to read a book to know that. These guys were warrior elites. So you're right, it was the Catholic clergy and the monks who were the intellectuals. And so you had individual scholastics, individual monks who had come up with an idea like that. But the Catholic Church institutionally, as a hierarchy, was very opposed to these ideas. Now, eventually, the Catholic Church becomes reconciled to what we call modernity, and there's a really good book by a fellow by the name of Tom Woods. Tom Woods is actually in this library. I read it when I was here. The Catholic Church grapples with modernity, and it talks about the debates within the church about how to meet the challenges of liberalism and secularism and science and all of these things. So it's an interesting book if you want to look at it. Institutionally, though, the Catholic Church was a bulwark against all of these things, and would remain so until really, certainly the 20th century. Certainly the 20th century. I wouldn't say Vatican II, that's probably too late. That was the 1960s. But certainly, there's a papal encyclical written in the 1880s where the syllabus of errors is what's called. You can look it up, where the Pope basically says, here's basically what's wrong. Science, democracy, capitalism, he's just railing against everything that's modern at all, saying that these are all wrong. This is why things are going as bad as they're going. So the Catholic Church was the leader of reactionary sentiment. No innovation, please and thank you. Yes, okay, so Jethro Tull. Yes, Jethro Tull, nitrogen in there, blah, 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 subsistence kind of. Yes, integrated market economics. So as you start having more goods, more production, you start having debates among policymakers, kings and their courts and their technocrats, of how do we harness this wealth to build more armies, right? We're in our period here of tremendous warfare. Let's not forget, all of these things are going on simultaneously. So it's weird to think that at the same time, that the 30 Years' War is going on, you've got guys sitting there thinking I wonder about analytical geometry. Analytical geometry is being created at this time by a fellow by the name of Descartes. Descartes is, of course, famous for his cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. But that actually wasn't what he was doing. What he did, he was actually a soldier. He was a totally brilliant guy. But he was a mercenary soldier. He fought for the Dutch forces. And one winter, while he was sitting around waiting, 'cause he didn't really campaign during winter. He kind of just holed up and chilled out. He was kind of just sitting around thinking, he was like, I wonder how I know the things that I know, and how am I certain about the things that I know? Because the church tells me, just believe this stuff. But the Reformation showed me that maybe we have some flexibility. I'm going to think about this. What can't I doubt? And so he starts running through all these things. It's called the Meditations. You can read it, you can find it at the library, or actually it's public access, you can find it on your phone. And he starts mulling it over. He starts saying, well, can I doubt this? Can I doubt that? And finally he realizes that he can't doubt one thing. What can't he doubt? That he's doubting. And if he's doubting, it's a process of reason. So if he can't doubt that he's doubting, he can't doubt that he's reasoning. And reasoning is a form of thinking. And if he can't doubt that he is doubting, which is reasoning, he can't doubt that he's thinking. And from there, he builds it up eventually to like justifying like God and king and authority and all these different things. But it's this really interesting exercise in logic. And one of the other things that he comes up with is analytical geometry, which is using algebra to solve for geometric problems, which has all sorts of interesting practical applications, right? For example, ballistics. Bullets, the trajectory of a bullet, right? You're interested in how to make your bullets go farther and faster and cannonballs and different things like that. A lot of these guys, like Da Vinci, and Michelangelo, we think of guys like Michelangelo as like painters and sculptors and stuff. But if you go to the museum that's dedicated to his honor in Florence, what you'll find is that most of what he did was related to like military applications. How to build a better siege engine, how to reinforce your wall better. He had all sorts of ideas for like, and they built like replicas of, based on his drawings. So there's like this spinning thing with like all these barrels of guns, and his idea was you crank this thing and it will spin this like rotating thing of gun, kind of like a Gatling gun. And then he had a number. My favorite one was it's a ship, and it's sailing towards me, and it looks totally straight, totally cool. But on the back is this massive blade. And it's tensioned down. And when you get close to the other ship, you cut loose the tensioner and it whooshing like that. So it's actually hilarious. You can view it online. You can just see all the pictures and exhibits and stuff. And he had like perpetual motion machines. But again, most of it was military stuff, which was kind of shocking to me. That like, I guess that does make sense. He would be like a military contractor. That's what these intellectuals would do. And they would get paid to go to these cities and make improvements in their defenses and things like that. And then in their free time, they could write and paint and do things like that. But that was more just like a side hustle, way to relax after the rigors of the siege day. So yes, this is all happening at the same time. All of these innovations, all these wars, all of these revolutions in agriculture. But we can't forget, the monarch is interested in armies. The monarch wants tax revenue. And if you've got all this trade going on, what as a monarch are you thinking about doing? Getting a cut, right? If you're a head of state, you want to get a cut of all this great trade that's going on. Anytime someone makes a sale, anytime someone makes a buck, you're trying to get your cut of that. That's what the government does, right? And especially during this period, right? They need money for these massive armies they're fielding. Remember, in 1400, this was still the period where, that rascally king of England is trying to take my land. Come on, guys. And then we all get on our horses and go ride and have some sword fighting, right? All of a sudden, this was the transition period where all of a sudden the nobles are useless in war. The nobles are completely useless in war. So you need to hire vast armies of foot soldiers. They also don't bring their own equipment. You have to give them their equipment. You have to arm them and clothe them and feed them and do all these things. It's very expensive. At the same time, your nobility, which has lost its social function and is increasingly losing its economic function in society too. Remember, their landed estates and stuff are not producing well because they're managed in the traditional way, which was however things have been going, just let them keep going that way. They're getting squeezed out by the gentry. The gentry are becoming the economically powerful force in the society. And that's how they're able to extract privileges. from people like the kings of England, and especially the Queen of England, because we had said a lot of that happened under Queen Elizabeth. So, there are all sorts of changes going on in society. These are related to the changes in the land. They're related to the changes in trade. Because, of course, it is the gentry class. It's that upper middle class of traders who are going to be doing that. They're also going to get involved, as we're going to see on Wednesday, with things like banking. These big commercial trading hubs. The reason that port cities tended to be so dynamic, just think about it. Okay, so ports. What do you have? Automatically you have some kind of shipping industry, right? You have some kind of boat building industry. You have some, and if you have a boat building industry, probably you have some fishing going on there. And if you have fishing, you have some sort of fish processing businesses going on here, which also means you have people selling it there. You also have the need to house sailors and stuff. So you have like housing in taverns and things like that, because you know the ships come in, they need somewhere to stay. They don't live there. They need some place to stay. That means you also have lots of little shops, because they're showing up. They've been out to sea for 6 months or a year. You know, they've got their wages and they need to buy some stuff. You also have things like insurance. Insurance businesses spring up here. You're about to sail out into the ocean in a wooden boat, right? Like you, as a thrifty businesswoman, you're about to give your hard-earned goods. You've put your money, your capital, your labor into making these things, whatever they are. I believe one of the examples they gave was like stockings. Well, that's all your money. Now you're giving them to me, right, to go sell. You might want to insure them, right? You might want to take out an insurance policy. It's like, what if he gets captured by pirates, or the ship sinks, or a million other things might happen. Insure. And we talked about the rise of joint stock companies. This was where we all pool our money together to make one of these ventures. So port cities tended to be very dynamic, especially as trade grows, because now you've got import and export businesses growing up. All the roads kind of converge and lead to these port cities. It's one of the reasons that the French and the English fought so bitterly over control of the Dutch provinces there. So they just had beautiful ports, wonderful access to the Baltic and to the Atlantic Ocean. And that area, of course, is where a lot of our early innovations sprang up. The Dutch East India Company, for example. Our early commercial banking operations. The first government central bank. The first big stock market. Which I'll definitely talk about, the rise of stock markets, and some really fun episodes on Wednesday. They have the Mississippi and South Sea bubbles. I'll also talk about the tulip bubble, if you guys are familiar with that.
Is Wednesday Arbor Day?
Yeah.
Class that day?
Yeah, we don't have class on
Well, that's fine. I'll just sit in my office and record it and post it on YouTube for you guys. Yeah, absolutely. Right thing. I gotta get with it. Thank you. So I won't be here Wednesday. Nor will you. Okay, I'm gonna make a note of that. Don't be here Wednesday. Okay, sweet.
You'll be quite disappointed if you show up.
No foul land. Most of these changes that we're talking about here, in the land and in commercial activity, are taking place in England and the Netherlands. These are the places where this is happening. Now, another thing that they're doing is they're trying to take down internal barriers to trade, because they realize that historically you had all these rights and privileges. Again, if you have grown some grapes and you've pressed them into wine as grape wine, but you've saturated, no pun intended, you've saturated the local town in wine, but you still have some, right? You still got 100 bottles. But you know from the scuttlebutt, you've heard that about 40 miles away, scuttlebutt, yeah, it means like the rumors, all that stuff, yeah.
My grandma used to say that all the time.
Really?
It makes me laugh.
Okay, right on. I got that from my uncle. He's an old, like, Arkansas dude. He's funny. He was really funny too, because he had like a PhD, but he talked like, I don't know, like, like the deepest of the deep south and all of this, and then he'd hit you with like, shoo, 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 like, whoa. He's a super smart guy. Love my plural. Not plural. Taking the goods over here, you heard, they have a shortage of wine over here. I can take my surplus wine, put it on the road, put it in the cart, drive over here, and sell this. Ideally. The problem was that traditionally, all of these little towns and bridges and places along the way had the right to like tax you. So you get to the first little bridge and you have to pay a toll to get over the bridge. Then you get to the next town and you gotta pay an inspection fee. Then you gotta go over another bridge. By the time you reach the destination where you want to sell your surplus, a large part of your profit has been eliminated. This is a huge problem if you're wanting to maximize economic output. This is one of the reasons that the European Union was created. It was to eliminate all the barriers to trade within these European states, to allow these goods to move faster, right? The faster the goods can move, the more goods can move, the more output there is, the cheaper the goods are, the better we all are off. The king is very interested in doing this because he wasn't getting a huge cut of these taxes. A lot of times he wasn't getting any at all, right? The locals are keeping a lot of these taxes. The king is saying, look, we're going to have one regime of taxation. It's going to be royal taxation. It will be paid in cash. We're not going to have any of this like, I brought you 2 chickens, sir. We're not going to have any of that. It's all hard coin. That's what I need. I need the coin. You give that to your local people. Need coin. So they're going to be ripping down a lot of these internal barriers to trade, taking away a lot of these rights of taxation of these local municipalities. Because the king understands, and his ministers have told him that so your majesty, this will be better, that these are going to create more taxable wealth, more income for the king, which is more state power for the king, which is, of course, what someone like the French Bourbon kings are interested in. Some people who are going to resist these changes, local municipalities, and these are headed by your local notables. These are people like your nobility. When they say when she talks about the local notables, yes, there's some gentry in there, but the gentry are much more willing to see these rationalizations. That's what this whole process is called, this rationalization. They're saying that having all these little individual taxes and all that stuff, it's not rational. It's not rational. It's impeding industry. And who wants to prevent the economy from growing? That's not rational. So anything that can improve the economy's output is rational. So we want to rationalize these things. We want to streamline the laws, make one set of laws. We want to have one set of taxes, one set of regulations. We're trying to order all of these things, trying to top-down order these things. And of course, the locals are going to resist it. The local notables are going to resist it. Another group that's going to resist it are the guilds. And she talks about the guilds on page 492. Guilds. Okay, so guilds were these kind of voluntary organizations that you could join. Okay, you applied to join them. Now they had the legal right to produce a certain thing, and they would get this right from whoever the authority was. So if you were in the Papal States, it was the Pope. If you were here, it might be the Count of Toulouse or whatever. But you then had a monopoly on producing vests. Vests are very in demand. Vests are in demand, or shoes or glass, whatever the case may be. But only you guys could produce them. Even if you had a great idea for how to make way better glass, you couldn't just set up your own shop and start selling glass. That shop would be closed down immediately. So the guilds basically are going to be a huge impediment to innovation. This is a closed system that is dominated by the masters of the guild, who are basically the people who, so what you did is you applied to join, you did an apprenticeship period of many years, then you'd be a journeyman, where you journey around applying your craft, and then you could get your, you would become like a master, and then you have your own shop, and then you would get your own apprentices. And so things were done the same way. And the guilds controlled how much you could produce, how much you could charge, what modifications you could make, like improvements. So this is all very anti-innovation, right? Clearly. And so one of the things that we're going to see the late Bourbon regimes attack, and then the revolutionary governments in France and the Napoleonic governments attack, is the guild system. They realize that the guilds are really holding back innovation, which is something that, of course, they're interested in seeing overcome. Because, again, these rulers are trying to finally balance different interests. On the one hand, These changes in the economy and society are producing massive disruptions. It's producing massive disruptions. You're messing with people's long-established, settled ways of life. You're attacking the privileges of the guilds, of the nobility. You're ruffling feathers. But you are interested in doing this because it's increasing the size of your economy. It's increasing the size of your tax revenue. It's increasing the size of your population. It is increasing your state power. We've already seen Europe's a pretty violent place. States are going in and out of existence. The state of Burgundy, destroyed. The Holy Roman Empire, basically neutered by the 30 Years' War. It's a non-entity. Poland, we're going to see Poland get completely wiped out during this period. Poland is going to be devoured by its much more powerful centralized neighbors. Poland is interesting. It was often referred to as a constitutional anarchy. It had a very, very weak king, very powerful and various nobles, and when they got together to try and do something, any one of those nobles could end the debate, end the session by just saying no. They had what's called the liberum veto, which just means I can refuse. And if any of the nobility objected, the whole thing was dead. Imagine if a bill could only become law. If every single congressperson agreed, there would be literally no laws ever. And this is basically what happens. And so Poland, this beautiful, big state, it's huge. I'm not going to waste time doing that, but look up the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Like, it's enormous. I mean, it's going all the way down to basically where Ukraine is today. It's into Russia, parts of Pomerania, huge. But it is easily defeated by the much smaller Prussia, by Austria, and by Russia, because these monarchs were able to exercise much more concentrated, deliberate violence over a sustained period of time. And Poland was helpless, and is partitioned 3 times, and is ultimately destroyed in the middle of the French Revolutionary Wars, which we will talk some about that. But the first partition takes place through the American Revolution. So, all of these things are going on. Europe is becoming much richer. Their worldview, again, is transforming. It's going from looking back on the ancients, right? How have things always been done? Where we're asking questions like, is this in accord with the church's teaching? That ceases to really be a policy question. The new policy question is this going to increase our industrial output? This is a huge shift. So, let's see. I'm going to real quick spend my last 5 minutes talking about a couple of sort of shopkeeping things. This is what has been going on in the background. So when the French Revolution starts next week, we must understand that we're basically looking at a more modern society today. We had been dealing with a situation where it was mostly subsistence level, local living, some trade, mostly a very religious worldview, to a very secularized, empirical, scientific worldview that is engaged in rational planning and production, privatization, global and market economies, the rise of that gentry middle class. The French Revolution is sort of the ultimate conflict there. Because remember, these positions within the bureaucracies that the kings had created, initially those went to nobles, right? But over time they realized, what would be even better is to give these positions to middle class people who have no other power base, but still be totally loyal to us. And so they do that. And the nobility are trying to claw some of these positions back from the middle class and to try and keep them from exercising any actual political power. And when the French Revolution breaks out, it's in part because that third estate, which is, it was all of France, but really it was like your Thomas Jeffersons, your George Washington. It's like your super rich dudes who are not aristocrats and who are like, yeah, we are the wealth of the nation, we pretty much should make some decisions here. And the old nobility are saying, never, we won't give in at all. And so they have some revolution and some war, which the French Revolution is, it would not have been fun to live through, but it is super interesting to look at in retrospect. Yeah, okay, so the open field system, no more. Enclosures, privatization, the rise rise of industrialization and the market economies. All very interesting stuff. All very interesting. We are basically going to be picking up next week because, as you see, your book takes you all the way to 1775. That was this chapter. It takes you all the way up to 1775, which of course is right there, American Revolutionary War. That's also a period of tremendous destabilization in terms of the French monarchy, and the French Revolution is going to start 15 years later. So that's pretty much where we're going to pick up. For this week, your quiz is already on there, and it is visible and available. Double checked right before I came in here. That is due Wednesday. So the quiz, Wednesday, 11:59 p.m. for discussion board. That will be open Thursday through Sunday, all the way to 11:59 p.m. For discussion board this week, here's what I'm looking for. I want your research question. Just state your research question. This could be anything as simple as, why did the guild system break down? Why did global trade expand when it did? Why were gunpowder weapons so transformative? Could be anything like that. It's just a general question. From that research question, you're then formulating a thesis statement. Why were gunpowder weapons so transformative? Thesis statement. Gunpowder weapons were transformative because it created an intense pressure to raise the necessary taxes to fund the large gunpowder armies. And then you talk about all the different innovations that required. The growth of bureaucracy, the need for specie payments and tax, because of course historically taxes had been in the form of military service, and then they had been in the form of in-kind payments. Increasingly we just want the money. So then you state your thesis statement. Your thesis statement is what you're going to argue. So your research question is, what were you interested in? What thing caught your eye? What were you interested in? Your thesis statement is what you are going to argue happened, or what you are going to present as happening. Obviously, you are undergraduate students. I'm not looking for you to come up with some wild, incredible, groundbreaking new research. You're essentially picking an explanation why did the 30 Years' War break out? And you're basically going to make a thesis statement on the basis of existing historical interpretations. Now, 3, provide all the sources you have so far. So I can take a look. Provide all sources so far. One great place to look, we talked about using Chat and Scholar and all that stuff. One great place to look is right here at the end of each chapter, where you get a list of all the primary sources that they use and all the secondary sources that they use. Just look at this incredible further reading section here. It is at the bottom of every single chapter. It's right after the questions. It goes on for pages, where she literally is telling you, okay, here's a list of 40 books about various aspects of the subject. So there's books in there about the growth of the guild system, the rise of the guild system, how the little ice age transformed European society, why population, and it's all scholastic stuff. It's all readily available. Most of it's available through the library. So, yeah, that's it. There you go. Any questions?
Is this for a thesis you've kind of already been working on?
This is what you've been working on. Yes, this is absolutely what you've been working on. That's why so many of the discussion boards were based around this. So yeah, I just want to make sure that we all have the ball rolling as we move into October. So, need anything? Please don't hesitate to reach out over the weekend. Otherwise, have a great Arbor Day and a great weekend.